Yes. And when I get these messages, I just totally don't understand. Connecting to cloud server. I mean, what are we seeding the clouds or something? I don't know.
You're flying high.
That's also possible, but I don't always feel that way. Although I have to admit, Lou, that since we moved into our new house, I feel a lot taller.
You are. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Francois.
Hi, Rabbi Danny.
All right. Okay, so for those of you who were here 2 weeks ago, we started this unit on mystical practice among the mystics of Tzfat, the 16th century Kabbalists. And we read the first part of this description of the mystical experience on Erev Shavuot of Joseph Caro, where Caro himself is sort of occupied by this mystical spirit, which is called the Magid. Okay? And so here's the here's what it says, that this Magid actually speaks through the voice of Joseph Caro and speaks to him and to all of his students who came together to study Torah Erev Shavuot, right? And by the way, it's in this, although the institution of the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, of staying up late to study Torah on that night, on the anniversary of the day when the Torah was given at Sinai, it goes back to around the 13th century, but it really doesn't become a big ritual in Jewish life until beginning the 16th century. And so here's, that we here's how the Magid finishes up. He says, "Therefore, O my dear sons, be strong and of good courage and rejoice. Cease not from studying, for a thread of mercy is stretched out over you, and your Torah study is pleasant to God. Therefore, stand upon your feet and raise me up, saying in a loud voice, as on Yom Kippur, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed." Right? And so here's how they react. They get up and they say it. They do what the Magid tells them to do. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. And the Magid repeated, "Happy are you, return to your studies, not interrupting them for one moment. Go up to the land of Israel, for not all times are opportune." Remember, this is taking place in Turkey, right? So he says to them, "Go up, make aliyah," right? "There is no hindrance to salvation, be it much or little. Let not your eyes have pity on your worldly goods, for you eat of the goodness of the higher land." In other words, it may not bring you profit, material-wise, to go to Tzfat, but, go anyway, right? Because you eat of the goodness of the higher land. Right? "If you will but hearken, of the goodness of that land will you eat. Make haste, therefore, to go up to the land, for I sustain you here and will sustain you there. To you will be peace, to your household peace, and to all that is yours peace." And then he quotes the verse from the Psalm, the Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. Okay? And they respond. He says, all these things did we hear with our own ears, much more of a like nature, all matters of wisdom and great promise. We all broke into tears at the great joy we had experienced. And when we heard of the anguish of the Shaheena because of our sins, her voice like that of an invalid in her entreaties. By the way, just so you know, weeping is one of those things that mystics did as a way of, going deeper into an altered state, right? You all know that, if you have a good cry, you feel differently afterwards, right? I mean, you don't have to plan it that way, but, sometimes it's true. And here, they do it in a very deliberate way. Right? We took courage so that our mouths did not cease from study in joy and dread until daybreak. In the morning, we immersed ourselves as we had done on the previous 2 days. There we met the sages who had not been present on that night, and we rebuked them, right? So the next day, all those guys who slept in, they get the business from those who were there. We told them of all the good the Lord had wrought on our behalf so that their heart died within them. They were just, completely flummoxed to know what had happened. I mean, look, if you heard the day after the Tikkun Leil Shavuot at the synagogue that everybody had a mystical experience like this, you also would be pretty flummoxed, right? If you heard that something like this happened and that, the rabbi spoke in tongues, or, that this mystical voice spoke out from within him, not his voice, but somebody else's, right? And you found out that you had missed that, you would have wished you'd gone, right? So, same thing here. They smote their own faces and wept aloud. We persisted in our criticism of them. He said, yeah, because you weren't there, we didn't get any more, right? So we said, let us join one another the coming night, and we shall be 10 in number. In other words, if we would have had a minyan last night, boy, would we have had an experience. Would have been much more intense and longer and better, right? So they agreed to that. We didn't sleep at all the first night. And of course, we didn't sleep during the day because the saint, meaning Caro, expounded the Torah in the afternoon and we all listened. But we girded our loins to repeat the program of the first night on the second. Okay? In other words, these guys haven't slept for well over 24 hours. You think that they're in a normal state of mind? Not exactly, right? Definitely in an altered state. So, in the great rejoicing that we were 10 in number, they did not wait until the time for the Mishnah reading. They didn't wait until midnight, because last night it happened exactly at midnight. No sooner did we begin to start reading the Torah portions, right? Then the voice of our beloved knocked at the door, and it began to speak again. Hearken unto me, O my beloved ones, choice ones, awake and sing, you who dwell in the dust, according to the mystery of the supernal dust, the 2 letters He, right? So what's that a reference to? It's the 2 letters in the 4-letter name of God, right? And there is a mystical meaning to those letters, to all of the letters of the divine name, right? But that's what he's referring to. And the Maggid spoke many words of wisdom and afterwards said, happy are you, my beloved ones. Happy are you that you have elevated me. I mean, now that you're a minyan, happy are you, happy those who gave you birth. Right? Fear not the reproach of men, and have no dread of their insults. For you have elevated the community of Israel. Know that you are the chosen few, etc., etc. Right? He said, you cleave to me. The glory is above your head, and there extends over you a thread of mercy. If permission had been granted for the eye to see, you would see the fire surrounding this house. In other words, you should only know what's happening here on the higher level, up in the, on the cosmic level, in the Sphirot. Therefore, be strong. Do not allow the knot to be untied. Elevate me by reciting in a loud voice Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem Kavod as on Yom Kippur. And so this is what he talked about for like half an hour. Then we returned to our studies, and then it came back at midnight, talked for another hour, repeating the praises of our studies. And it said, see, did any people ever hear the voice speaking as you did? And he quotes the verse from Deuteronomy, ask your father and he will inform you, your elders and they will tell you. In other words, all these years, nobody's ever heard of such a thing as what you did. I mean, you've been worthy of this mystical experience. And so let your eyes be upon your ways from now onwards. In other words, watch what you do, right? Be very careful in all your practices so that you can be worthy of other such experiences. Let each help his neighbor and say unto his brother, be strong. Let the weak say, I am mighty. And let each be great in his own eyes and should belong to the king's palace and have had the merit of entering the vestibule. Endeavor now to enter the great hall and do not leave the vestibule. Okay, so the great hall, of course, that's the divine throne room, so to speak. For whoever leaves to go outside, his blood be upon his head. If you don't take seriously the stuff that you're involved with up at this level, you may be on an elevated level, but you can fall pretty far. Right? The higher you go, the farther you can fall. He says, awake, my son, see that I speak to you. Awake, my beloved ones, be firm and valiant in battle. In other words, keep up the good work. Be strong and rejoice, and a thread of mercy will be extended over you daily. Okay? Observe how intoxicated you are with worldly desires. Awake, O drunken ones, etc., etc., and so on and so on. This is how the Maggid speaks to them. And then the writer, Alkabetz, okay, the student of Joseph Caro, goes on saying, now my sons, hearken unto me, incline your ears and your hearts to me. You can't be such a fool as to hear all this without resolving to return to God with all his heart and soul and might. I call heaven and earth to be my witnesses that all I have recorded here and in the tract I composed is not even 1/100th of what actually transpired. In other words, the mystical experience was much more intense than I can convey in writing. It's never what you can write down afterwards. If you have a mystical experience, by definition, it's more than you can possibly express, right? And if you've ever had a mystical experience of some kind, you probably understand that. Because, how could you explain what you went through to somebody who didn't share that? Okay? And even with regard to the tract, and this is what I am writing here, you will sometimes note an asterisk after some words to denote that here a mystery was revealed that I could not allow myself to record in writing. In other words, there were parts of this that even Alkabetz wouldn't share in any detail, at least, with just the people who hadn't been through it, right? You know, Alkabetz and Caro did do what the Maggid told them to do, and they went to live in the land of Israel. Of course, both of them became important figures in the community of Tzvat. Caro already was an established, outstanding scholar. Alkabetz, the poet, and as I mentioned last time, the author of Lecha Dodi, which, as we'll see later on when we come to the unit on prayer and ritual, that in itself is an extremely mystically oriented piece of work. Let me just take questions and comments from here. Yes, Lou.
Referring back to intoxicated, any introduction of hallucinogens, either liquor and like wine or anything else?
I don't think so. I don't think that there was anything, any, shall we say, substance abuse involved in these mystical experiences. But when he talks about intoxication, well, he compares it to what alcohol might do to a person, right? What does it do? It changes your state, right? May, shall we say, reduce your inhibitions, might cause other internal changes for you as well. Mystical experience is like that in some respect. It's comparable to that. Not the same, but comparable. But scholars in the field of Jewish mysticism do not believe that there's any artificial intoxication involved here. It's all through, performing certain actions. I mean, if you go 2 nights without sleep, your mind is going to feel a lot different from the way it normally does.
I asked that question more because there are some number of people, less than 10 the first night, 10 or more the second night. It wasn't just an individual experience.
Yes. But probably not something that involved ingestion of hallucinogens or something like that. Or even more than, let's say, Kiddush wine, right? I don't imagine that would have enhanced the experience. If you'd already been up, the whole night and day before, even a little more than Kiddush wine would probably put you out. I don't know. Maybe they were, a different kind of group than me. I think they are, by the way, but never mind that. Okay, other questions or comments? Okay, so let's go to the next piece here, which is from this book of Chaim Vital. Now, one more thing I want to mention about Joseph Caro, right? Now, Caro was born in Spain, and he was, part of the group of Jews who left Spain in 1492. He left as a youngster, but his family obviously had faced that kind of choice and all sorts of difficulties during the period leading up to 1492. Caro, as a consequence, knowing what other Jews went through in Spain, he had a very big fixation on martyrdom. And elsewhere, the Maggid tells him of how his evil inclination is to be burned out with the fire of the Torah. So, that's kind of, compare that, if you will, with the effect of the Inquisition. And Caro knew a lot about that. Caro had taken to heart many of the stories about the horrors of the Inquisition. And so, martyrdom was always in the back of his mind and sometimes in the forefront. Okay, so going on to Vital. Vital is the student of the great mystic Isaac Luria in Tzfat. And Luria gives him extensive directions for mystical practice. And we're going to look at some of them here. Right? So he says, these are the things that my master of blessed memory told me relating to me and the root of my soul. Right? So part of this is related to the fact that Luria was understood to have special powers to be able to look at a person, to read their face or to read their palm, and to understand all sorts of things about that person, what sins they had committed, what inclinations they had, what level their soul was at, whose soul root they were connected to, all these kinds of things. That was Luria's mystical ability. Okay, so here's an experience of Vital. He says, one day I visited him, Luria, a whole month having passed, during which I had performed none of the yichudim he had prescribed for me. In other words, yichudim were mystical meditations. We'll leave it at that for now. Mystical meditations. And he recognized this in my face. In other words, he could read me and know that I hadn't done what he had asked me to do. And he said, if you leave me for a day, I shall leave you for two. Okay? Meaning, this is only, if you don't do what I tell you to do, you're only going to grow farther away from me. You cause great harm by failing to perform the unifications, for you caused the souls who wish to cleave to you to become separated from you. So, I had an excuse, right? I just wanted to study Torah during that period because, these souls did not come to me as openly as was, as was appropriate. And he said, nevertheless, I must not fail to perform these unifications daily. And it's more important than studying Torah because it unites the upper worlds and so serves both the purpose of Torah study and unification. Torah study is good, but it on some level it also helps to unify the sfirot on the upper level. It's not just about what you happen to learn. It's just the very intention of learning Torah helps to bring the sfirot to a better place, right? To make the whole spherotic system function more effectively. It's a cosmic effect. And he warned me that when I perform unifications, my intention should not be only to attract the soul, but to repair it on high. In other words, you want to be having that cosmic effect, not just to have, a certain state of mind while you engage in that mystical meditation. When I went with him to Tiberias, to Rabbi Akiva's tomb, so here's another thing, they would go and visit the grave sites of certain sages. And Rabbi Akiva was supposed to be one of the great mystics among the rabbis, hence they would go to his grave. He also told me, Rabbi Akiva said to him, in other words, Luria got a visitation from the soul of Rabbi Akiva. I should mention Rabbi Akiva's name 10 times consecutively before each of the 3 daily prayers. As a result, he will become impregnated in me and will help me very much. He told me there was no need for me to say Rabbi Akiva, only Akiva. Right? So very detailed, very precise instructions about how to do this. Again, how to attach himself to the soul of Akiva as he begins his prayers each day. He also told me that until Sukkot, I will need help, and he will assist me whenever I perform these mystical meditations. But after that time, I will not need any help, since the 2.5 years that I sinned when I refrained from studying Torah will be completed. Apparently, Vital went through a period here where he was not as involved in learning Torah, or, he may have been trying to make a living, or he may have gone off the track completely, right? Nonetheless, says, previously, even if he did help me, it was haphazard because it was impossible for it to be regular, but from that time on, it will be regular, right? So that's, that's one paragraph from his discussion of these mystical practices, right? And here in paragraph number 15, he says, he also commanded me not to refrain from performing the unifications he had transmitted to me. If I go to prostrate myself on the graves of the righteous, I mean, they were not kidding about, going to visit the gravesides. They frequently did practice prostration on those graves as a way, again, of entering a different, an altered state. Right? If I go to prostrate myself on the graves of the righteous, I should do so either on the eve of the new moon or on the 15th day of the month, for then it is more effective than at any other time. I should not go on Shabbat, festivals of the new moon, for at these times their souls ascend to heaven and cannot be communed with at the grave. It's like the souls are not there. Once he sent me to the graves of the righteous on Chol HaMoed, on the intermediate days of festivals, to pray there, but I did not prostrate myself. Right? Now, what was the purpose of attracting a soul? So the mystics believed in a process which is called Ibur. Ibur means the joining of the soul of a dead person to a living person. Right? That soul would in some way inhabit the living person. It's as if, think of, what it would be like if one morning you woke up and the soul of one of your ancestors was inhabiting you and sort of encouraging you as to what you should be doing. All right, here's a mitzvah that you've been neglecting and you need to start doing it. Or you need to fix this relationship which is troubled, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? How would that feel for you? Okay? Would that change your life around? You bet it would. So here, that's what Ibur could do for you. Right? But the root of the word ibur is the same as that for a woman who is pregnant, right? So this soul is going to inhabit your body and your soul for a certain period of time, just like, a fetus. Now, if that added soul is the soul of a really great person, wow, okay? So you think that would have a great effect, yes? Right? And that could help you to achieve a higher level for yourself, right? So Luria tells Vital to attach into himself, to take on in himself the soul of Rabbi Akiba, right? Because Akiba's, was this great mystic. So, and we're also told there are certain special times when Ibur works better than other times, right? We're down the road. We'll look at this notion again, along with the idea of Gilgul, which is a more permanent reincarnation. But the mystics of Sfat definitely believe in this kind of soul habitation, at least for a limited period of time. Okay, comments or questions up to here? Yes, Lou.
Is there any relationship between visiting the grave of a mystic with visiting graves of our, I'll use the word regular ancestors?
It's not that that's a bad thing to do, but it doesn't have the same effect unless your particular ancestor was one of those great souls, one of those elevated souls. So then you could take on their soul by doing this particular ritual in one way or another, and then that would help guide you. That soul would help guide you to a higher level. But not if it was just, one of your stam ancestors, right? One of your ordinary ancestors, right? So my maternal grandfather was a pawnbroker, right? So when I go to the grave where he is buried in Oklahoma City, so I do the same thing that I would do if I were visiting any other grave. I don't prostate myself on, if I were engaged in this kind of practice, I would not prostrate myself on his grave. I would not try to take on his soul, right? Because he was just a Stam Yid, just an ordinary Jew. He wasn't one of those scholars. He wasn't one of those Kabbalists. He wasn't one of those elevated souls.
Wasn't it saying that the soul was at the graveside, though? Was it not saying
The
that?
soul is in the grave.
In the grave.
Yeah.
And is that,
So,
I mean, that's not typically viewed as the Jewish perspective, is it?
Yes and no, right? Look, we are all raised in a much more rationalistic tradition, right? Which is that, the grave is where the body is buried and therefore it's sanctified, but it's not because the soul, sits there waiting for you to take it on, right? But the Kabbalists definitely believe that. So, you get to choose which tradition you want to inhabit and how much of it you want to inhabit, Karen. You don't have to believe anything that I share with you in this course, right? It can be just a curiosity, right? It can be just information about our tradition and how certain things came about or come about in our tradition. It can show you some of the energy that creates new things in our tradition, right? So for instance, we all know that the Chabad Rebbe is dead, right? Rabbi Schneerson, the seventh Chabad Rebbe, died in 1994. He is buried in Queens, right? Well, we also know that an elaborate setup has been created there for people who go to the grave, who ask the Rebbe questions at the grave with the idea that his soul might impart unto them the wisdom or the answer to their questions and tribulations, right? Now, I'm not a big believer that, the soul of the Rebbe is going to direct you. What I do believe is that, people who focus their energies in a certain way often tap into things that are not available to them otherwise. And that, sometimes that sort of thing works, but it doesn't work because the soul mystically arises from the grave and inhabits your body. Right? If that works for you, you're welcome to it. Yeah, other questions or comments here? Okay, so let's go to the next text. This also from Vital, where he talks about how a Holy Spirit or a Magid such as Joseph Caro had would convey its message. And here's what he writes. This is the secret of prophecy in the Holy Spirit. It is assuredly a voice sent from above to speak with this prophet or with this man endowed with the Holy Spirit. But this same supernal spiritual voice cannot by itself materialize and enter the ears of this prophet unless it first clothes itself in the physical voice which emerges from this man's mouth when at a given moment he studies Torah or prays and the like. And then that voice clothes itself in the physical voice joining it. It comes to the ear of this prophet who hears it. Without the man's own present physical voice, it cannot achieve existence. So in this heightened state, you might call it a trance state, right? The Magid takes over the physical voice of the mystic and is going to speak through that person, right? And Vital talks elsewhere about, the body being a garment for the higher soul. And here the body is really being taken over, at least temporarily, by another soul, so that the mystic can get direction, prophetic wisdom, whatever it needs. Okay? Comments or questions up to here? Okay. So next, in Tzfat, those who were part of the mystical circle, they would commit themselves to follow certain specific practices. The word for these practices is the word hanhagot. Some of you are familiar with the term minhag in Hebrew. Minhag means a custom, a customary practice, right? Hanhagot is from the same root. Hanhagot were spiritual and ethical practices which took you beyond the norm, right? Whatever, the normal observances, this was a way of doing something more, right? And here I share with you what Heschel had to say about such practices. Heschel said, a new form of living was the consequence of the Kabbalah. Everything was so replete with symbolic existence, with symbolic significance, as to make it the potential heart of the spiritual universe. How carefully must all be approached. A moral rigorism that hardly leaves any room for waste or respite resulted in making the Kabbalist more meticulous in studying and fulfilling the precepts of the Torah, in refining his moral conduct, in endowing everyday actions with solemn significance. For man represents God in this world. Even the parts of his body signify divine mysteries. Okay? So this is kind of a description of not only what they did, but what it meant for them to do these things. And these were not practices meant for ordinary Jews, right? It was a spiritual elite who were involved in such things. And if you wanted to accomplish these goals, very high goals, right? So you had to be able to live up to a higher standard. You could, not even have the slightest degree of sin, or even normal physical desires. So there are many, many ascetic practices involved here, occasionally even severe mortifications. Okay? Now, the material world for these people, the material world is just, it's so inadequate. It's so flawed. And so they try to separate themselves from it. And that, and to reach into the higher realms, into the Sfirot, and kind of clear it out from all that sin and make it possible to bring the Shaheena, the divine presence, back from exile up to mate with its cohort, the Sphira of Tiferet, and so as to unite the entire system and make it work well. Again, some of these sages in Tzfat were refugees from Spain and Portugal. Right? So they were very sensitive to the issue of the exile of the divine presence. They knew what that meant. In fact, some of them may have lived as Marranos. So that's that is at least a spiritual form of exile, not being able to live as a Jew publicly. Right? So here in text number 5, we're going to look at Caro's list of practices. I mean, this is not a whole list. These are just excerpts. And we'll see that there are very frequent themes in this list. All right. So the first thing mentioned here, be careful never to speak an unnecessary word, whether during day or night. Okay? Take care to avoid any kind of talk that leads to frivolity. And if you overhear such talk, never laugh. This extends to the complete avoidance of mockery. Okay? You could tell these guys did not have a great sense of humor. Right? Never lose your temper over mere material things. Right? That's pretty good. Right? We would all agree that that's, the intention is not normal, but it's a nice ethical practice. Okay. Let's go a little farther. Do not eat meat at all for 40 days, except for a little on Shabbat. Do not eat horseradish. Right? Now, the piece about a little bit on Shabbat, right? The rabbis were, there was kind of a halachic sense that people should eat meat on Shabbat if they could, right? Because that would enhance the feeling that Shabbat was a special day and a day of joyfulness and so forth, right? So you ate meat. He says, but don't eat too much, right? Don't overdo that enjoyment even on Shabbat, right? We'll see that kind of spirit in regard to other things as well. Drink no wine during these days, except one drink at the end of the meal. That was pretty standard back then. You had, you'd have a little bit of wine to wash down the meal, right? But normally, people drank wine in much larger quantities than most of us would do today, right? That's kind of how you got by when life was a lot tougher than it is today. He says, don't do that. He says, be gentle in speech to all people. Never be proud. Right? So be exceedingly humble in spirit. Right? Sleep in your own bed. In other words, apart from your spouse. But when you have to have marital relations in order to fulfill the precept, to be fruitful and multiply. All right, so that's, the presumption is you wouldn't normally do it, except that you have to, right? Because it's a mitzvah. But otherwise, you sleep in your own bed. None of that, coziness between couples. But rise up from her bed a half an hour after you have completed the act and return to your own bed. Be careful to avoid taking pleasure during eating, drinking, and marital relations. Act as if demons were forcing you to eat that food or indulge in that act. You should much prefer that it be possible for you to exist without food and drink, or to fulfill the duty of procreation without intercourse. Yeah, pretty interesting, yes? Always have your transgressions in mind and be anxious because of them. Talk about Jewish guilt. All right, never eat for dessert more than one measure. No more than 20 of melons, grapes, and raisins. Except on Sabbaths and festivals, do not eat of more than one type of fruit. At the beginning of the meal, cut 3 measures of bread, and during that meal, eat no more. Never drink your fill of water. Train yourself to keep your eyes downcast, so you will never chance to gaze at a woman forbidden to you. By the way, obviously, we note that there are no women in this mystical circle. This list was meant for men, right? Next, remember, how important the Mishnah is to Joseph Caro. Have the Mishnah in mind during the meal. Study a chapter of the Mishnah before Birkat Hamazon. Do not allow your mind to wander from me, even for the slightest moment, and limit your enjoyment. When you are eating and desire additional food or drink, desist from it, right? Don't do it. If you do this at each meal, it will be as if you offered a sacrifice. Your table will be an actual altar upon which you slaughter the evil inclination, right? So one of the very frequent themes here is limiting one's pleasure, right? Now, there is a Talmudic directive which says, sanctify yourself through what is permitted to you, meaning don't give yourself everything that's permitted, right? And then, there is a counter tendency to that, which, says, if you take on more restrictions than you are supposed to, like, let's say if you are a Nazirite, back when people would take vows not to eat meat or drink wine for a certain number of days, that's a sin against your soul. That's problematic. Denying yourself pleasures that are permitted and indeed, in many cases, mandated. Right? Well, to the mystics of Tzfat, it's much more important to deny yourself the pleasure rather than to take what is permitted to you. Because if you take seriously the idea that the Shaheena is in exile, that there is this cosmic rupture that so affects everything of life, and you have the opportunity to address that and to improve that situation. So, we Jews, we should be in a state of mourning and not have more enjoyment than is absolutely necessary. Right? How you talk, right? Which, that's a frequent theme in Jewish ethical works, and even in, Jewish ethical teachings today, not engaging in gossip, not engaging in criticizing other people, right? Here, that is taken to very extreme measures, right? There are many examples on ethical behavior in all these collections of Jewish practice. Control of your thoughts, self-denigration, great humility, constant repentance. All these are very important themes. Torah study, devekut, cleaving to God, although it doesn't use that term right here. Those are kind of ongoing goals. Everybody has to engage in regular Torah study. Everybody should be cleaving to God regularly. The Mishnah has special attention, especially in Caro's list, right? Devekut is kind of a private thing, and you engage in that in solitude, in addition to all the things you do together with the other people in this group. Now, the phrase that you saw in here, act as if demons were forcing you. That's a phrase from the Talmud. But there it is given as a way to avoid thinking about someone who's not your wife, right? Here, it's much more extreme. Now, any pleasure, even permitted pleasure, it's really not proper, right? And even though today, that doesn't seem very Jewish to us, and it doesn't seem right by modern standards, certainly, that's how the mystics of Tzfat felt. Okay, let's stop here and take comments and questions.
Rabbi Danny.
Yes, Francois.
When they mention the 3 measures of bread and not drink the full cup of water, can you please expand more in like the meaning of like?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
So don't eat 3 or don't eat more than 3 measures of bread somewhere on the paper that you have.
I'm missing. I
Okay.
must have missed something that you were.
I'm just trying to find this paper. One second, please. Okay, you can take other question right now till I find this one. I'll get back with you.
We talked about only have 1 piece of fruit and only so much bread, and I think he's asking what that's all about.
That's about minimizing pleasures, even though they are permitted to you, and even though eating is a necessity, right? You got to eat to live, but don't overdo it. Right? Make sure that you don't enjoy those things too much, because you don't want to be too materialistic. You don't want to be too attached to the things of this world, because that's only going to take you away from the bigger issues, which are not of this world, but on the cosmic level, this Road.
Okay, I did find it. So I'm not sure if I'm, okay.
Did that answer your question?
So I was actually referring to, at the beginning of the meal, cut 3 measures of bread, and during that meal, eat no more. Never drink your fill of water. So I'm just trying to figure out like a more detail, what considered measure of bread?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what, probably
Okay.
like, like a small slice that you would cut, right? In other words, what he's saying is don't fill yourself up. Don't have everything that you might enjoy at a meal, because that's too much materialism. That you don't want to be bogged down in the material world, because all those physical, if you start having, 4 and 5 and 6 slices of challah, right? And we're not talking about big slices. We're talking about little slices, right? Just a little bit, right? Because back then, they probably didn't have big challahs anyway. So you only want to take a little, because whatever physical things you indulge in, they tend to take you away from the spiritual goals, from the more elevated realms where you want to be involved. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yes, Karen.
I kind of followed that, but I'm unclear about why you then go to the next step to have to be in mourning. What is that?
Well, that's about the exile of the Shaheena. Okay, so there's this rupture on the cosmic level. Right, the Sefirot are not working as they should, and so that should depress us. Right? Look, if you were let's put it this way: if you were a Jew living in 1945, right, you would be naturally depressed. To have a huge celebration, just for your family, simcha or whatever, in 1945, you would probably have the sensitivity to scale it down a little bit, right? And what Caro is saying here is that's the way it is all the time when the Shekhinah is exiled. That's our problem. Yes, Lou?
2 questions. One, the exile of the Shaheena, is that limited in Caro's mind to the expulsion from Spain and Portugal, or does it include the dispersion of Jews from Judea 1,400 years earlier?
Well, it includes that, but even the exile from Spain, as well as the exile from Israel, are not the main event. They are just symbolic of what's happening on the cosmic level. That's the key rupture.
It is on the cosmic level, then, would that be a loss of spirituality as opposed to a physical removal from one land or another?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Second,
But he wouldn't define it. He wouldn't define spirituality, I think, the way that most of us do. When you think about spirituality, what does that term mean to most of us? Right? For most of us, it's about, how we develop a relationship with God. What are the things that we do as mitzvot in order to sustain a relationship with God, or just, how we live as Jews. For him, spirituality is all about how you help God achieve God's goals in the higher realm. That's real spirituality for him. The other kind of spirituality, and we talked about that in class last year. It's that's the tzorech gavoa. That's the divine need, right? For most of us, religion is much more about us than it is about God, right? So, what does it do for us? How does it help us feel more spiritual or make us better people? For Caro, spirituality is about how do you help God achieve God's goals. Okay, we are at the end of our time for today. Hold on to your questions because we're going to have more of this next time. Okay? We'll look at other Kabbalistic Hanhagot practices. All right? So we'll see you next week. Thank you all for being here.
Thank
Thank
you, Rabbi.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua tov.